Well, good morning. A great pleasure to visit this beautiful area, this wonderful country, and I hate to partially answer the question of our previous speaker. I hate for you to think you have to choose between China and the U.S. when the correct choice is very obvious. So my first degrees are in international relations and diplomatic history, and I found this presentation last evening and this presentation very interesting and stimulating. And the world is in a very disruptive era. And so what I'll try to do is share with you some thoughts with respect to what's going on in the cooperative world per se. A week ago today at about this time in the morning, I was sitting in the boardroom of FCS Financial. FCS Financial is one of the owners of the 4 large agriculture finance cooperatives in the U.S. It's a system of approximately $250 billion. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. I grew overnight. And so this, I was sitting there, I'm one of the 3 outside directors of this system, and we had a new chief financial officer, and she was presenting for the first time the estimated results, which would be terminated or disclosed on December 31st. And she was going through, she was nervous, as you can imagine, and she was going through the results, and she got to the section on, we have an insurance subsidiary, and she got to there, and the numbers, the profits or the savings or retains were quite large. And of course, she was pleased to announce that. And a new director just blurted out, "When will I get it all back?" And this is if in each of your cooperatives, each of your mutuals, you have probably heard that statement. How do I get it back? When do I get it back, etc. And of course, this statement startled her. And she was, first time in front of the board, and we have a U-shaped boardroom. And so she walked toward the director without saying anything. You could just see her mind. What should I say? 1, to save my job. Okay. 2, to really be a professional. She's very, very intelligent. She had been with the co-op about 7 years and understood the politics, etc. So anyway, what do you think she said? I should ask you to write this down. What do you think she said? Well, we will get to that at the end of my talk. Okay. And hopefully, some of the things I share with you will help or will inform how you answer what she said. And you've all been in this situation, and so I thought that would keep most of you awake until the end, depending on what you might do otherwise. First thing I want to do, and perhaps you should know, I have a very privileged position. I literally, in the past, I'm just a poor country boy from northern Wisconsin. I grew up on a dairy farm, and my family had invented the cheese, and we had the 9 dairy farms around the cheese factory, and if there was 30 minutes free, I had to go and work in the cheese factory. And that, of course, instilled in me a work ethic, but not one that my parents particularly liked. I majored in history, diplomatic history, and international relations, and they wanted me in science, like my other 4 brothers. They also wanted me in agriculture, like my other 4 brothers, okay? And I was thinking of saving the world and playing professional basketball. And so this was a little conflict, and so I was an outlier, like probably most of you have been in your families, if you work for or are advocate of mutuals and cooperatives. So I went on to college to play basketball and study, of course, and it turned out that I ended up going to South America, and I coached the Olympic basketball team for my lovely wife's country, Uruguay. And so I spent a couple of years there, came back, went to work for a very large investor-owned firm, Tenneco. And I learned what I did not want to do in life. It was learning comes from experience. And so I went to the Dean of Agriculture at the University of Wisconsin, and I said, I want my PhD in applied and agriculture economics. And Dean, you should know me because I'm going to solve the world's hunger problem. Okay. And I don't know if I'll do it alone, but we'll attempt that. And very quickly, a professor of cooperatives took me under his arm and left me with a set of values and appreciation for people like yourselves that just overwhelmed me. And fortunately, I have spent the rest of my life either being a leader of cooperatives in the United States or an academic. And so my position is traveling around the world, listening to people like yourselves, and learning how you lead, govern, and manage collective action, per se. And we've been here 3 days, and it's just wonderful listening to Geraldton Fisheries, to CBH. I even programmed the RAC driverless car. Just marvelous, and your welcome has been very warm and wonderful. So thank you. What I thought I would do is share with you some observations I've made in the last 12 months. In the last 12 months, I've spent 10 days with the King of Morocco. I've been in the Netherlands. I've been in Germany. We're headed to Cuba very shortly. And so what I'll do is share observations of collective action we see going on in these countries and in the United States per se. First, I think it's important that we do a few basics. What I have found is a co-op is not a co-op, is not a mutual, is not a co-op, is not a mutual. Whomever you are speaking with, the driving force behind them seems to be the same. But how they do it is really quite different. And we speak past each other often, I'm sorry. And so I just want to lay out just a couple basics so that you know from what angle I'm coming from, and then I'll go through these observations. First of all, I meet a lot of new CEOs, not new chairs, but in general new CEOs who come from outside the mutual or co-op world. And almost within the first 3 or 4 sentences, they will share with me that co-ops are no different than any other type of business. That's their opinion. So I want to just quickly point out, I have a very strong belief that if they continue believing that, they will not remain in that position very long, okay? And so these differences, number one, what's the purpose of a mutual or cooperative? Well, it's to optimize, excuse me, but I'm an economist, so I'll use some words that really don't, it doesn't matter. The purpose of a co-op or mutual is to optimize the member's preference function, okay? Meaning members, those who patronize or transact with the cooperative, it's their objective functions that have to be optimized, all right? In the case of, I'll just compare it with an investor-owned firm, the purpose is to optimize the investor's preference function. And that investor might be a blue-haired lady in Miami, not a patron, not a transactor. So this difference, right away, the purpose is really distinct. Number two, ownership. It's the user who owns. In the IOF, it's the investor who owns. It's the residual claimant that is the investor. They are the residual claimant. In control, in cooperatives, in general, throughout the world, it's, or at least the basic principle is one person or one member, one vote. That depends on the country. It depends in certain commodities, etc. There are exceptions to that. In an investor-owned firm, it's in proportion to your investment. So we've just identified at least three major differences, and this new CEO, it will slowly dawn on her or him that, gee, this matters, okay? What about benefit? Who reaps the rewards? And this is a very interesting issue. In the cooperative or mutual, it's the user, the transactor, okay? But it's not just financial. There are other rewards or benefits that are reaped from this collective action. Yesterday we were I had the opportunity, because the wonderful BCCM staff arranged this, we went out to the Geraldton Fishery Cooperatives facility near the airport. And the CEO spoke of how, he gave a little bit on financials, but he spoke primarily of the benefits of being in this fishery cooperative, of many other things that, like Tim mentioned, social capital, what the feeling of belonging. And he went through a whole list. And if you go back or just think of your own mutuals or cooperatives, these types of benefits are invaluable. As an American advertising type or advertisement says, they're priceless. And so this, it's not just the Geraldton Fisheries, it's almost every group that works together, that derives. Now, as Tim said in his presentation, he was quoting Alfred Marshall, you need a solid economic reward, but it's more than that. And I want to toss out, and this isn't discussed and it isn't researched, I challenge you, Tim, and the researchers in the room. Usually in investor-owned firms, you set your strategy, even in your family-owned firms, you set your strategy and then you structure how to accomplish it. In cooperatives, the cooperative structure has an impact on the strategy. It constrains or opens opportunities, but the strategy structure interface is far more complex in a cooperative or mutual, then it's a fuzzier area. And those who don't, let's say, appreciate what you do, they will call you foggy-minded, or you're living in the gray area, or whatever. It's because cooperatives and mutuals are much more difficult to govern, lead, and manage. Much more complex. You're dealing with people who have multiple objective functions versus people who have a single objective function. Make money for me. That's the investor-owned firm. When I worked for Tenneco, that was everything was that. Every week, I had to prove that I put something on the bottom line, period. They didn't care what I did on the weekend. They didn't care what I did, if I had a family or not. Bingo. It was, what did I put on? Working for co-ops, it was, in those that failed, it was the opposite. They cared too much about my family and a few other things, right? And so I'm sure you're faced with that. But this is one basic I wanted to point out. A second is, why were you founded? And I want, you've been through many lectures on this. I just want to point out that in general, the reasons you were founded were for defensive reasons. I come from a background of athletics, and there's offense and defense. And everybody wants to be the center forward on the football, or what we call soccer, right? They want to be the Pelé, or they want to be the Maradona, but they want to be the big scorer. Cooperatives, mutuals, were formed for defensive reasons. And the way you stand out is preventing the opposition or the rival's offense from scoring. And you don't drive as big or pretty a car or automobile if you're a defender as if you were the leading scorer on your team. This is interesting. It sounds overly simplistic, but I think it's critical. And many of you sit on boards, and it's very important that when you're interviewing for future CEOs, future senior vice presidents, etc., it's that this person that you are choosing must love to play defense. This is an interesting, primarily, I should put primarily in front of every statement I make here. But this is an interesting thing to think about on your way home. Now, quickly then, I want to, why do co-ops exist? What is their goal? Why are you still here? That's an interesting question. Why are you sitting in this audience? It's because you are employed or engaged or a member of a mutual or cooperative. And whether you use this terminology I'm going to use or not, it's what you do. Your organization primary objective is to provide private goods. These private good is an economic term. It means it satisfies your needs. But cooperatives and mutuals also provide collective goods. And this is critical that members understand. We heard Tim talk about education. We heard the first two speakers speak about education. This collective good is that extra you provide. It is maybe for the community. Maybe it's for a certain part of society. Maybe it's the social capital that when you leave, you feel better and you don't kick your dog. The point is that cooperatives exist to provide private goods and collective goods. we use that in a couple of other observations, so that's why I want to just point that out. So, by the way, on Monday, the United States has many, many different magazines. One of the most famous is called The New Yorker. And The New Yorker is considered to be perhaps the most elite magazine in the sense that it hires the best writers. Their stories, usually I can understand 60 or 70% of them, so I feel pretty good. But their weekly edition is coming out on Monday, and there's an article called "Could Food Co-ops Make a Comeback?" And if you have questions for me on what is happening with the co-op movement in the U.S., there is a significant regeneration of co-ops in the U.S., or mutuals, okay? But this is from a lady who, as she was growing up, lived in Brooklyn, where this food co-op was formed. And this food co-op had 1,700 members at the beginning. And so they were struggling, as all new co-ops do, and I want the benefit, but I don't want any responsibilities type of mentality that dominates, okay? And when the co-op said responsibility, accountability is as important as your benefit stream, it exploded, and it now has 17,000 members. But there's a quote in this article from a lady who grew up with that and now lives 50 miles away. She has done very well professionally. She drives the 50 miles every 4 weeks to put in her 2.5 hours of work at that food co-op, which the discounts for the members, those 17,000 members, is between 15 and 50% compared to the supermarket sitting in the next block. For her 2.5 hours every 4 weeks. If she doesn't do it, she loses membership for a month. The point I want to make here is a penalty, a responsibility that is monitored and enforced. And this, I think, for co-ops, I spend a lot of time in South America and in Africa, and they're sold on cooperatives. But what's so amazing is they don't understand the responsibility. And that's something for us, for you to succeed. These monitoring and enforcing these responsibilities is critical. Well, let me get to the trends. I'm sure I have like 1 minute left, and I'm just 10% into this presentation. So I'm going to rattle off very quickly some observations I've made in the last year about what's going on. Number one, there is a radical shift in organizational form. One example, but this is happening all over the world. In the US, in the year 2003, there were 8,400 firms, investor-owned firms, traded on the exchanges, 8,400. In the year 2017, 14 years later, there were 4,000. The number of traded or listed companies had dropped by more than half. This is shocking. Some of it is merger, but in general, it's a replacement by 5 types of new organizations. One is called a wicked anarchy, Wikipedia. Nobody's in charge. And it's growing very fast. A lot of your server units. This is amazing. The uncorporation is gaining very fast. These are sophisticated types of partnerships and limited liability partnerships in companies. Mutuals and cooperatives are part of this, but we don't have time to go in today. But this is a shocking number, and it's almost subliminal. You don't feel it right away. It's almost like stealth moving in. Okay, there'll be a tension. I think co-op leaders, the people in this room, have to deal with this tension between technological advances and what we see happening in Hong Kong, which I'll call political social disruption. And cooperatives, like Julie was asked, what implications? It will have implications for co-ops. And co-ops can play roles in this, ameliorating this tension. An interesting observation you might not be aware of, cooperatives in non-British marketing board countries, I'm sure that you'll just stay awake all night figuring that out. But Australia fits under a former colony, a marketing board colony, like Canada, like South Africa. These countries, what's interesting is the marketing board over 70, 80 years formed a mentality that someone else will deal with the supply chain. I will produce or I will purchase, but you don't think vertically. It's very interesting if you go to the Denmark or the Netherlands, because they can't grow, they have the most sophisticated vertically integrated cooperatives. And in the US, typical, we have a mix of both. So this is, and it comes from an institutional change introduced in the 1920s and 30s. It's amazing how important institutional changes really matter. Okay, I have 21 other trends. I'm going to skip over them. I do want to point out there is, in the world, we see consolidation of co-ops. Co-op education is becoming, I have never seen so much interest in co-op education. And in a sense, it verifies some of the things that Tim said in his presentation this morning. Let's see, member heterogeneity. One of the hottest topics in co-op research is heterogeneity, how different each member is, and can we put them in taxonomies and typologies. But member heterogeneity is different than consumer heterogeneity. It's really important. Anytime somebody mentions heterogeneity, you should say, which group are you talking about? And we study too little member heterogeneity. And that's, you could come back to the private good, collective good. Co-ops end their lives. I don't want to say they fail, because I think it's very important to realize that co-ops and mutuals are not the answer for every situation, for every group. It's really important to understand that, because you become too religious. And if you become too religious about mutuals and co-ops, you start missing Tim's point this morning. You better have an economically viable entity that can compete in a global or at least some type of market. But they end their lives for two major reasons. One, they don't meet an important member need. And so that's industries and macro forces coming and maybe displacing why you were formed. And secondly, internal frictions unattended turn into factions. I don't want to be too Americanish here, but if you were to read one publication written by Americans, 1787, the Federalist Papers. There are 85 essays attempting to convince Americans to vote for the new Constitution. Federalist Paper number 10, and you can just Google it, it'll come up. The first sentence says, factions destroy democracy, and mutuals and co-ops are democratic organizations. And so it's very powerful. All right. Last night you celebrated heroes, co-op heroes. We see this happening all over the world, and it's so important. If your co-op is approaching 50 years or older, by the way, in the United States, of the 2,000 agriculture co-ops, 1,000 of them are older than 75 years. On average, in the United States, agriculture co-ops are 5 times older, longer longevity, than our investor-owned firms in agribusiness. That's an powerful, I mean, why is that? That's a very powerful question, in my opinion. Co-op research, Tim and your group, it's moving toward studies of heterogeneity and behavioral social sciences. Ostracism, I was just in the Netherlands on a defense of a PhD, and ostracism was the topic of that dissertation. So I didn't believe it. I mean, I raised my hand when they said, should he pass or not, because it was beautifully done study. And I went home, and I've been with probably 15 co-ops since then, and I've asked each group, do you suffer from ostracism? In every one, more than half the members or board members raised their hand and said, yes, we feel excluded or prejudice against us, etc., in some form. I asked in more detail about that, and of course, some of them were just minor issues, okay? And they didn't like how I was dressed or something, anyway. But the point is, wow, what an important area. And this student was a pioneer, literally, in addressing ostracism in co-ops. Opportunities. Melina asked me to talk about opportunities. China, 2007, 0 cooperatives. They passed in 2006 a co-op law, their first real co-op law. Today, they have 2.1 million new agriculture co-ops. 2.1 million. 12 years ago, 0. It's really interesting. There's an opportunity there. Critical, skin in the game, but more than anything, if you're looking for opportunities, think back on the defense. Defense, there's another term for it in economics called market failures. Go around the world looking for market failures, and wherever there's a market failure, that's an opportunity. You could start with your own members, and in a sense, you might call it a need, but it's probably a market failure. That is, someone's feeling abuse from another transactor, or there's asymmetric information, or there's missing services, but that's a market failure. You look for it, and that's an opportunity per se. All right, I promised you, and I will finish. Melina, you told me I had 7 hours. And, anyway, here we are. So how does the story end? Do you remember Starla, the new chief financial officer? And as I said, she's walking in this boardroom, right? And this director's sitting right there, And he blurts out, right, is that all coming to me? Or it'll be distributed. And she's just, what do I say now? Because I think internally she wanted to just blast the guy, right? But this was part of her training, new CFO. So Starla, and I wrote out her answer so that I wouldn't miss it. Starla, the new CFO, answered like I think most co-op leaders from Australia would have answered, at least those who were honored last night in their speeches. I joined this cooperative because I believed cooperatives represent the dual phenomena. This is Starla answering, after she took maybe about a minute to think of this. That is, this dual phenomena, the yin and yang of business models. Okay, cooperatives represent the noblest of aspirations of civilized society. And they represent the base reality of human nature. That dual view. I hope I can help balance this complex dual nature of group action. And the director, I'm guessing he'll end up trying to be a bully. I've been on this board 30 years. He's been on 4 months, all right? And you can just see, he's just burning, and he didn't understand her answer to begin with, and he's angry. But he doesn't say anything, but no one on the board does either, okay? She realizes he didn't understand. That's a bigger sin than blasting him, right? She's doing a one-upsmanship. So she goes to her second. She's going to dig this hole deeper, right? Her second. We work hard so we can help you make sure we are here for your children and the community you live in. And the board, I have never heard a louder, complete silence in my life. Thank you for inviting me to Australia.